All right. Greetings, everyone, and welcome to tonight's Chaucer's Books virtual author discussion with author Dave Zirin, as I lose my computer. He's here to talk about his latest book, The New Press Publishing, The KAEPERNICK Effect, Taking a Knee, Changing the World. My name is Michael Takeuchi, and I'm the events coordinator at Chaucer's Bookstore, a 47-year-old independent bookstore located in Santa Barbara, California, and owned by our founder, Mari Curley. To purchase tonight's book, browse other titles, or check out our upcoming events, please go to our website at chaucersbooks.com. Our next scheduled event occurs tomorrow, October 5th at 7 p.m. Pacific with local poets David Starkey and Paul Willis. Looking ahead at next month's lineup, which includes in-person events for young writing sensation Via Bleidner, U.S. Representative Adam Schiff, and the following month, we are pleased to host none other than the great Susan Orlean. While our guests and I are the only ones seen and heard on this webinar, please feel free to utilize the Q&A function located at the bottom of your screen. Tonight's event is being simulcasted on and recorded for our YouTube channel. It will be available upon program's completion. YouTubers, please post your questions for Dave in the chat. So let's begin. Tonight, I am so pleased to welcome journalist Dave Zirin. Dave is one of Putney Reader's 50 visionaries who are changing our world. He's a sports editor of The Nation, a columnist for The Progressive, and the host of the Edge of Sports podcast. His many books include A People's History of Sports in the United States, Game Over, and Bad Sports. My favorite book is Welcome to the Terror Dome, the title inspired by the rap group Public Enemy's song of the same name. The group's co-founder, Chuck D, even wrote the foreword to that book. Chuck D was actually the one customer I was too much in awe of to approach. He had such a magnitude. As for Dave Zirin, this former sports scribe thought he was and is the one sports writer not to be missed. He wrote about things that all the others seem to miss. Please welcome from the Capital Beltway, Dave Zirin. Hello.
Great to be here. Thanks so much for having me.
Great to see you again. It's been about 15 years.
Yes.
So, and you look younger. And
I was going to say you look younger. Or I thought you were about to say it's been 15 minutes since that's when we were talking.
That's true. That is true. Well, for me, it's an Asian blessing, I guess. So we'll get to your latest book in a moment. But one thing I've always wanted to know since I first met you is, how did you get your passion for writing about this area of sport that has been seemingly neglected in the decades prior?
Well, it really started for me in college. I was a sports obsessive. And I was also a politics obsessive, but I saw these things and particularly like protest politics and social change politics, but I saw these issues as existing on parallel tracks. And that really changed for me when a basketball player named Mahmoud Abdul Rauf made the decision in 1996 that he wasn't going to come out for the national anthem. And when asked why, he said, well, the flag may be a symbol of freedom and democracy to some, but it's a symbol of oppression and tyranny to others. And he got so much crap for this. There was a ton of Islamophobia around him saying this, even though his great influences politically were actually Noam Chomsky, who's Jewish, and Arundhati Roy, the great Indian author and theorist. And yet it's so much more tempting for the mainstream media to just say, oh, it must be because he has a Islamic name and had just converted. He was known as Chris Jackson beforehand. And I was so taken with this story. And I saw a talking head on ESPN say, well, he must see himself in this tradition of activist athletes. Like Tommy Smith and John Carlos, Billie Jean King, or Muhammad Ali. And that just blew my mind, this idea that there was such a thing as an activist athlete. And this was before the internet, so I couldn't Google activist athlete. I had to really do the work and go into, the library and look stuff up. I had a friend taking a sports and the black athlete class taught by a professor named Mahmoud El-Kati, who I just saw. So he's fresh on my mind. I couldn't get into the class, so I read all my roommate's books. I studied more for his class than I did for any of my own classes.
Yeah.
And and so I got really into just the idea of learning as much as possible about it. I never thought about a career or anything like that. But that just, I don't know, it was just always this thing I wanted to do. So when I started working as a teacher after college, I taught third grade, still, learning all this about sports and politics. And then I started getting jobs in various newsrooms, and I was willing to do anything to learn how to be a journalist and work at a newspaper. But it was very important to me to have that little bit of real estate in the paper where I could write a sports and politics column. And so I worked at papers where I sold ads or I swept floors. I did whatever needed to be done for the paper, covered police union meetings. That was the worst. But the thing that kept me going was knowing that once a week I had that little real estate of 800 words. And that's how I got started doing this.
Interesting. Prior to that, though, did your parents instill some kind of morality or, of you? Because your whole thing about your writing, all your works, which are all amazing, is the fairness factor. And things have to be fair. And I wanted to know where that came from.
I mean, it's more of a political conclusion than it is something that came from the home. My parents divorced when I was 3 years old. My mom worked. Certainly there's an element of thinking that life was unfair for a lot of years of my childhood. I grew up in New York City. It was a very rough place to be a little kid until I was about 15, and not really a kid anymore. Then it got very fun. But so it really true, the idea of fairness, just from looking at the world and looking at issues like inequality, racism, sexism, homophobia, and never really losing that question of why does the world really have to be this way? And looking at sports as an incredible platform for how people have challenged these various forms of oppression, over the decades. I mean, we were talking before this started about the mass incarceration of Japanese and Japanese American people during World War II. It was the great author Naomi I don't want to mess up her last name, but she wrote this Murakama, and she wrote about speaking about that as an issue of mass incarceration, as opposed to internment. It's an amazing book, and that she wrote, and it's just one of those things where and I think about that, and I think about the way sports was used in the camps as a mode of survival and community. Like stories like that to me are like my lifeblood, so I just look at history and I see so much unfairness and so much inequality and so much inequity. And I see sports often used as a cudgel to keep that inequality going, like as a really destructive force. But when you see people using that platform for actual good and to bring people together, when you see people try to harness the power of sports, I mean, that's where, that's where I live, at that corner. And that's what I try to have to be my small, very humble contribution to creating a more fair world, is making sure that those ideals get expressed through the world of sports.
Nice. And along that lines of the internment, there's the book Eagles of Heart Mountain. I highly recommend.
I know that book.
It's an amazing book. So if you're out there, if you're interested, please purchase that book. 5 years ago, Colin Kaepernick took a knee. Yet the issues of the anthem, playing the anthem and protesting the anthem have permeated prior to that. And you mentioned Chris Jackson, Mahmoud, who was a great guard, and he was an amazing performer, despite the fact that he had to fast because of this Islamic religion.
Yes.
This has been an issue for years, and I think a lot of it just stemmed from the writer of the anthem itself, Francis Scott Key, who was a slave owner, who deemed blacks inferior. He was quoted as such, and I think it was the third stanza of the anthem itself was racist. I think I have that right there. And I want you address this in your book, and I want you to talk a little bit about that. I think it's about no refuge could save the hireling and slave.
Yes. He's basically saying we're going to track down escaped enslaved people and kill them. We're going to send them to the gloom of the grave, because that was one of the facets of the War of 1812 when this was written in 1814, was the fact that escaped enslaved people were signing up to fight with the British against the United States because of promises of freedom, promises of manumission. So this is a reference to that. It relates to the book because, you know, a lot of the people who kneeled during the anthem, they did their research and they really started to ask themselves this question about, why am I kneeling and paying tribute to a song that celebrates my own oppression or the oppression of my teammates, as the case may be. And I think that it's that obvious, but I think like this is more just like the proof of the pudding that people looked up. Like I didn't meet many folks who read the actual text of the anthem and said, yes, I am going to kneel during the anthem. It's more about what the anthem we're told it represents, what we're told it represents. I mean, we're told it represents these aspirations for freedom and life and liberty. And people just, including Kaepernick, like saw that gap between the promises of the anthem and the lived reality of far too many people in this country, particularly Black and brown folks. So they said, you know, we're taking a knee to protest the fact that we're being told to pay tribute to something, while, as Kaepernick said, people are police are getting away with murder. People are dying in the streets, and police are getting away with murder.
And to add that Francis Scott Key only believed that slaves should be emancipated if they were returned to their original country. So they have a great basis, you know, an argument. The people who knelt. Yes. Let's talk about your book, though. It's an incredible book, and what I really liked was the fact that, first of all, you wrote about it, but you stepped out of it. A lot of your books are from the first person perspective, but although it had your flavor in it, I didn't see. It was the stories of all the high school, the college, and the professional athletes who took a knee and why they took a knee. So I'm wondering why. I'm glad you did it, but I'm wondering why you decided to take this tack to write this book.
I'm glad you caught that. That was very, very conscious. It involved some arguing with some editors and some friends who proofread it, who said, well, this isn't like your other books. Where's your voice? And it was very important to me to not center my own voice and center the voices instead of these incredibly brave high school, college, and in some cases professional athletes. And that was actually, frankly, because of Colin Kaepernick's silence, largely silence over the last 5 years. He hasn't been entirely silent by any stretch, but particularly the last 3 or 4 years, like, you really haven't heard much from Colin Kaepernick. And what I thought was very important was, okay, if we're not going to hear Cap's voice, whose voice should we be hearing? Should it be my voice? I didn't think that was appropriate, or what should be said. You know, people don't need to hear my analysis of why Kaepernick played this way in week 8 and what he said to reporters in Miami. I mean, that just seemed like a big waste of time to me to do a sort of rehash. What I wanted to do instead was to center the voices of the forgotten, center the voices of the young woman in Seattle, the young man in Idaho, the football team in Camden, New Jersey. Like, I wanted to center people who I felt like were getting written out of the history books, because the whole idea for this book came when I was talking to John Carlos, the 1968 Olympian. And John Carlos said to me in sort of an offhanded way, you know, after we raised our fists in 1968 in Mexico City, he said, after we raised our fists, young people started raising their fists all over the place, you know, at track meets and at, you know, youth events and all these things like that. And that just got me thinking, like, wow, I thought I knew everything about 1968. I mean, I wrote John Carlos's memoir with him, for goodness sakes, and I had never heard about this. And it really made me think of a lot of the stories, some of which I'd written that were for The Nation, which were like these one-off stories.
Mm,
Of like,
mm,
oh, look at this high school in Detroit where the kids had garbage thrown at them. Look at this cheerleader who had to leave her college because the oppression and
yeah.
harassment got so terrible. And I had to take really think to myself and take a step back and be like, do we do the history a disservice by encapsulating it in these one-offs instead of trying to look at it holistically, trying to look at it broadly, trying to look at it as a kind of unconscious social movement? I mean,
Mm,
don't we find it incredible that hundreds, if not thousands, of young athletes took a knee during the anthem? That they, in Colin Kaepernick, saw not so much a hero as much as they saw someone who was offering up a language of how to protest as an athlete. Isn't that amazing? And
yeah.
that he actually bequeathed to the movement this method, this almost like a Rosetta Stone for how you can showcase your
Mhm.
discontent as an athlete. You use that anthem space and you take a knee. I mean, and then as I was putting the book together, summer of 2020 happens, the largest protests in the history of the United
Yeah.
States after the police murder of George Floyd. And I went back and I called like the dozens of people who I'd interviewed for the book, and they were all either out in the streets or organizing people out into the streets. And that made me realize that while tons of roads may have led this country to the summer of 2020 and the reckoning therein, one of those roads runs straight through the athletic fields of the United States.
Wow. Wow. How you construct this book, I found really interesting too. Is you constructed it from high school to college to pros. What I found was striking is the high school and the college sections were over twice as long as the professional section.
Sure were.
And I'm glad you did, but why did you decide to do it that way? Because I mean, the pros were what sells books, quite frankly.
The pros are
But then,
what sells the books. Megan Rapinoe wanted to talk to me for the book, and I didn't want to
yeah,
shy away from that. And also,
yeah,
it's not even so much that they sell the book as the pros are kind of like the handle for people because people are somewhat familiar with those stories. And hopefully, I gleaned some new information that maybe they hadn't heard before in terms of those interviews. But it was just very important to me that it just bookended because partly too is the pros are there to tell a complete story in that, I've had people ask me, well, why didn't you divide the book by gender? Why didn't you divide the book by sport? Why didn't you divide the book by region? And I think there's a very specific set of challenges when you're a high school student and you sort of have to put yourself out there to take a knee and risk ridicule and all kinds of other
mm,
things. College, where you're risking a scholarship and your
mm,
role and your place in a community that can be far from home. And then the pros, where you're risking a paycheck. Three very, very distinct set of circumstances based on where you are when you take that knee. It was so
mm,
important for me to differentiate that so people could understand the specific challenges. Now, there's certainly common threads between all three, the most
mm,
disturbing common thread being that of violence and the
mm,
idea that violence could be visited upon you for daring to take that knee, daring to take that step towards activism. But the
mm.
differentiation by age was profound enough to me as I was doing the interviews that, I went to my editors and I said, this is the way I want to do it. I want, and I'll write little intros to each one to explain why, but it's so important that people hear these voices unvarnished from these different stages in their lives.
What I found striking is that they all realized how much they're risking. They're putting their whole livelihoods, whether it's a college scholarship or a place on a college team or a professional contract, like the baseball player Bruce Maxwell, the Oakland A's
Yeah.
did. And they were all had that common bond. They also had the common bond of being influenced by Trayvon Martin, the murder of
Yeah.
Trayvon Martin, for arming himself with an iced tea and Skittles, pretty much. But they all had their own stories, and that's what I felt made the book really come alive. Is there were individual stories, different reasons behind that. Was it difficult for you to get them to talk about these reasons?
Well, that's the thing that was like really striking is that it wasn't difficult. I think it's so bizarre to put it this way, but I think I and the book benefited greatly from the pandemic because that's when I started writing it. And a lot of
Mhm.
these young people were just basically under lock and key as their schools were trying to
Yeah.
figure out how to do remote learning. And they were bored and they were frustrated. And normally it's hard to get anybody on the phone these days, let alone a teenager. Usually you have to text first or else they'll think there's some kind of emergency or something. I deal with that in my own home all the time. It's like I call my daughter, 17, and she says, "What's wrong?" And I say, "Nothing. I'm just calling." And she says, "Oh, well, you called, so I thought it was an emergency." And like, geez, you can't call anybody anymore. You got to text first and say, "Is it okay if I call?" Uh, but for these young folks, man, they were bored and they were like happy to open up. So
Yeah.
I was able to get a lot out of them, much more than I could have hoped. And it started to just shape the book. The fact that these discussions were getting a little deeper than I thought they'd be. Because you know how a book is. It's like, because I know
Yeah.
you're working on one that sounds amazing. Like you start with one idea, but then it can go in a direction that you just didn't see because of knowledge you accrue or somebody you speak with.
Mhm.
A book is not like a car engine where you start with a design and then just build it.
Mhm.
It's more like I don't know. Like, what's that expression? A horse by committee is a hippopotamus. It's kind of like that, where it's like
Okay.
it's set out to be a horse, but it's gonna look like a hippo by the end. That's how it was working on the book, and
Yeah.
they just took it into directions I didn't know it would go in, and I'm just so
Mhm.
gratified that they talked to me. I gotta say, like, in case we don't get to it, and I don't remember to say this to you, like I started writing this book at the start of the pandemic feeling very, very pessimistic about the state of the world, about our place in it, about our role to change. I try to write with verve and optimism, but it was hitting me really hard at the start of the pandemic about the way that our choices were narrowing. And
Mhm.
talking to these young people, and this is before the summer of 2020 and the protests, when I started talking to these young people, it started to just make me more optimistic. And I've really, like, my thinking on this has evolved pretty dramatically because it's like I, at the same time, now have so much faith and trust and hope in this young generation and their ability to change the world. I've got so much respect for them, especially given what they've lived through over the last 20 years. And
Yeah.
yet at the same time, I know it's not enough after talking to them. It's not enough for people like my age, for example, to just sort of stand on the sideline and applaud them or say to them, please save us, Generation Z,
Mhm.
like in giving them that burden. I think we have to figure out ways to give them space to lead while also offering ideological, material, organizational, and political support to them.
Mhm.
And that's really what I want to be doing going forward is I want to
Mhm.
help them. And this book is like a modest step towards doing that. Another modest step is I'm taking the money from the book and giving it to this mutual aid organization called
Oh yeah.
Serve Your City, DC. Yeah. And it was a pretty easy decision to make because I was just thinking like I want to. There's all this courage that I'm documenting. The end result of that courage should not be my wallet. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah.
Like I
Yeah.
want to try to because it's like so the only one who benefits from all these people taking risks and getting death threats is me. That sounded a little weird to myself.
Yeah.
So paying it forward to this mutual aid group, and you know what? This mutual aid group, they're called Serve Your City. You could look them up at
Okay.
serveyourcitydc.org if people are curious about them.
All right.
And they do amazing work. And one of the things they did was they set up 500 backpacks for kids going back to school filled with school supplies, and they included a copy of the book in each backpack. So
Mhm.
that to me is what it's all about, is trying to figure out a way how to push the wheel forward and
Yeah.
to use these stories as a way to do that, like to really see these stories as having an end other than selling books.
Mhm. Before we continue, Dave, I'm going to make you a co-host here in case I lose my power because we actually have a thunderstorm going on. It's actually raining in Santa Barbara the first time in recent history. So
I thought it never rains in sunny California.
exactly. I guess you guys in the east took all our water from us because you're flooding out there and we're
Yeah,
in a drought.
lovely.
So, all right. So there you go. What I found amongst these individual young people is a toughness that I did not give this generation credit for.
Mm,
And I mean, but if you look at it, they were born in war.
hmm
They're dealing with, you know, with what, racism, systemic racism of the time. They're dealing with COVID and they're dealing with a lot of problems. And I think these young people, especially in the high school section, really showed their resilience. And it
Yeah.
really impressed me. And I was wondering, what kind of impression did you come away with from these young people that you dealt with? Did it affect you emotionally, or you said you were feeling more powerful, which is good, but I'm just wondering how it made you feel to see them
It
react the
affected
way
me
they did.
so strongly. I got no words for it, how much it affected me. I mean, I went from being somebody who was feeling pessimistic to feeling optimistic. I was so humbled by the trust that they gave to me. Like, that's something I have to say. Just the absolute trust. And
Yeah.
I just, there was a feeling of cross generational solidarity that
Okay.
I'd never really felt before. And that's what I'm saying too about, like, I used to just
Yeah.
see everybody. This is just, I think my thinking has gotten more thoughtful, for lack of a better word. More because I used to consider just everybody to be a potential comrade. It's like, I don't care how old you are, I don't care where you're from, race, creed, whatever. It's like we're going to figure out how to work together and be comrades. And now I'm really seeing that, this generation has a very particular set of challenges and a very particular set of needs that
Mm,
people who are my age, who have some experience, like, need to figure out how to help them, and maybe take a step backwards and figure out how to provide support while also providing them space to lead. So this has
mm.
been a real political reckoning for me in my own mind
Oh,
about
okay.
my own place on the firmament of resistance politics. It's like I got to figure out a way how to help them create the kind of change that they're so thirsty to make, because they're just
Mm,
not willing to settle for things that I think we were, at the end of the day, willing to settle for. Half measures
yeah.
on the environment, no real structural reform around race and racism. I mean, there's just they've got calluses too, because, as you said, like, being born in during a time of war and just having that be their regular reality.
Mm,
This is they've got a different set of calluses, they've got a different set of toughness. They take a ton of unworthy abuse from bad faith political actors, and I'm just really excited to see what they're going to do.
mm. And I'm sure you see that firsthand because you have a teenage daughter.
Well, that was also very much affected me, because I see just it in her and her friends. Like,
Mm,
if they don't like something, they're going to walk out of class just like that. It's like, it
mm,
reminds me of stories from the 30s. So workers like, oh, you're doing this, oh, we're going on strike. And
mm,
it's they believe in the power of self-emancipation,
mm,
and they're not waiting on someone to do it for them. And I think that relates to how they saw Colin Kaepernick. Like, they didn't see him as a messiah or somebody who was going to deliver them from racism. They saw in Colin Kaepernick an inspiration and a method by which they could also protest.
mm. Interesting.
And it
Speaking, you had
relates to
mentioned.
Trayvon. I'm
Oh, go
sorry to
ahead.
interrupt, Mike, but
Go ahead.
it relates to just something you said earlier about Trayvon Martin. I mean,
Mm,
the fact is that more people I spoke with mentioned Trayvon Martin than mentioned Colin Kaepernick when I asked them about inspiration. And for
mm,
them, a lot of them, we forget this, were like 10, 11 years old when Colin Kaepernick was stalked and murdered by George Zimmerman. And then, of course, no justice comes out of that. And for them, I mean, that's like a scar that they carry, in like something that really, really warped and disturbed them terribly in terms of where they are, where they were relative to concepts like the American dream and equal justice for all, like these things they're being taught, they all of a sudden see that reality runs counter to that, and they never really lost that. And
Mm.
they suffered with Trayvon Martin's death, the way you hear about civil rights activists suffering after Emmett Till is murdered and lynched in Mississippi, like something that they would carry forward. When you're 11 years old, you're old enough to wonder why the world has to be the way it is, and young enough to ask that question in the first place. And so that's where a lot of them were at when Trayvon was killed.
Wow. What struck me also is, I'm glad you picked Megan Rapinoe, who's one of my favorite athletes in there. But what really struck me on the female side is you have a number of them. A lot of them are cheerleaders.
Yeah.
And
not on purpose.
No, but they are actually have it more difficult than athletes in a way. In fact, the fact that they're female, they're women, the fact that they're on the front lines, they're nearer to the crowd than the athletes are. They're right next to them. They are unmasked. They don't have helmets. They are out in the open, yet several of them opted to kneel while some of their football brethren decided not to.
And some of them opted to kneel precisely because they're football brethren. I found that to be very interesting. And also, in putting together the book, it was just, to me, what was so important was representation. Because, of course, I interviewed people who didn't make it into the book. But the people who didn't make it into the book, it wasn't because their stories weren't compelling. All the stories are compelling. But it's because I wanted it, first of all, to just not be too long, because and that's important. And also, I wanted it to tell the truth about who took a knee. So yes, football players took a knee, but yes, a lot of women took a knee. And also, yes, a lot of cheerleaders took a knee. And trying to get to the bottom of that, like, what is it about cheer that pushes people in that direction? And a lot, because I never went to school with cheerleaders growing up. I went to small New York City schools and then small school, college. And so it just, I never had that experience. And I learned that a lot of these cheerleaders, they see themselves as really the face of their school. Like they are the representation of their school for the outside world. So the outside world comes to a football game, you see the cheerleader. And that's really what I was trying to get across. And what they were trying to get across was, when we take a knee, it's our way of telling the outside world that we have problems in this world and that this campus is not immune from them.
There were some wonderful accounts. And the other thing is, don't say that cheerleaders aren't athletes, because they're great. They're great athletes. In terms of females, the one thing I'm very ashamed of not knowing the story, being from Santa Barbara, being a local journalist, was the story of Michelle Wright, UCSB, University of California, Santa Barbara basketball player who took a knee against the wishes of her coach, who is currently the coach at UCSB. And this really struck me because of the fact that it didn't seem, this was about the time I was transitioning away from journalism, but I had heard nothing about this. It wasn't covered in any of our local media, and which speaks to the larger point of the suppression of news of brave actions by these people are not told.
Yeah.
And I wanted you to comment not only about Michelle, but just about the suppression of news.
Yeah, I mean, just to say that Mikhail's story, I found out from a friend at the University of Minnesota who said, I'm going to school with somebody who kneeled, because you're right. It wasn't covered in the local papers, and, doing various, internet and online searches for people to interview, which is what I did. That's how I found people and then contacted them on social. This was a unique case of a word of mouth story. And I just did a panel with Mikhail. It was a Zoom panel, which is, not preferred to really get to know somebody, but we did talk a lot before the panel, because that was actually the original plan for the book, was to not only travel places and do events, but to try to hook up with the people I interviewed so we could be on
Yes.
together. And then I only really got to do that with Mikhail, and it was so great. And her story is so compelling. And because, someone joked with me that the book should be called What to Expect When You're Protesting, sort of like what to expect when you're expecting. Like, because it's the idea is that you're following, like, what do you do if your coach stabs you in the back? What do you do if your teammates don't want to talk to you? What do you do if you get death threats? What do you do if the school administration tries to be nice and then pulls back? I mean, and so the story has the book has like scenarios for each of these possible things that you might face if you want to take a knee. And Mikhail's story is so interesting because it really got me thinking about the knee and why there's so much power in the gesture of the knee. Because Mikhail's story, actually, I heard this from a couple other folks as well. You have the administration trying to negotiate with the athletes about perhaps other things they can do. It's like, and they even offered to we'll buy you t-shirts that say Black Lives Matter that you can wear during the anthem. We'll get you black sashes that will attach to the uniforms that you can wear the whole game. Just please, by all means, don't take a knee. It could have called the book Knee Hysteria or something, because that wouldn't be a very good name of a book. But there's just so much to this. I mean, the gesture has become so universal that if you and I decided to do it while the anthem was being played, everyone would immediately know why we were doing it and what the deal was. It's so it's become so quickly so universal, and strikes fear in the hearts of even college presidents and administrators who are sympathetic, because they're so worried about donors and the rest of it. And it's just very, very intense. And Mikhail just sort of telling me this story, it just really got me thinking about the knee and the symbolic power of it. And I appreciate her honesty. Her story is really something. And then, of course, her being in Minnesota after the police murder of George Floyd, or in Minneapolis, really. And that connection, I mean, it was terrific to speak with her.
What is she doing now?
She's a grad student.
Okay.
Studying, very interesting. Like, she's actually studying the effects of social media on her generation. And that in and of itself is really interesting to me.
Which brings me to the question about social media, the influence of the movement, positive and negative. What is your take on, the reactions via social media and of support and against? I'm wondering what your thoughts on the role of the social media.
Well, I was thrilled when Facebook shut down today, but
that was great.
Yeah, but sad that WhatsApp shut down also. But it was a hell of a reminder, because so many people depend on WhatsApp to contact friends and relatives in other countries, particularly. But it just also goes to show you, why we have to break up these companies too. Because if Facebook in charge of Facebook, WhatsApp, Instagram, I mean, and they go down, you're talking about cutting off a lot of the communication capacity for a lot of people. Social media giveth and social media taketh away. In this movement, it's been incredibly powerful because it's allowed athletes to go around any and all filters and just tell their stories. It's allowed people like myself to sort of chart who has been taking a knee, because, if their pictures online, and then trying to contact people through social. I mean, so there's a way in which it connects us incredibly, but it's also been the site of the most harassment of the people who took a knee. Whether you're talking about death threats, whether you're talking about other kinds of threats. And I mean, in so many ways, social media is like the white hood of the 21st century. It does allow racists to practice their craft with anonymity, even if they're becoming more confident and less anonymous by the day. So, I mean, there are these positives there, Mike, which you want to cling to, but it comes with a degree of toxicity that I think we'd be blind to, or we'd be fools, I should say, to ignore.
But in the sense that it helped with what happened with the Atlanta Dream, the WNBA team, I think that was a driving force. If you can tell the audience about what you wrote about? I mean, because it actually made a difference in our politics in
Yeah.
terms of what the NBA did. So if you can talk a little bit about that and address.
I mean, where do you begin with the WNBA? I mean, in
Yeah.
2016, before Colin Kaepernick even took his knee, that summer it was the WNBA athletes who were not only wearing black shirts during the anthem after the police killings of Philando Castile and Alton Sterling, but WNBA athletes also were pretty amazingly enacted their own kind of civil disobedience where they refused to answer questions from reporters unless the questions were about racial justice and Black Lives Matter issues. Then they
Mhm.
answered the reporters. I thought that was a brilliant kind of media jam, if as it were. Well, it
Yeah.
was pretty cool. And
Yeah.
and the role that they continued to play throughout the movement and into, most importantly, that fall of 2020, where if the WNBA doesn't intervene in the Georgia Senate race between WNBA franchise owner Kelly Loeffler, who was
Yeah.
using her own players as her own personal Willie Hortons, to
Mhm.
demonizing their support of the Black Lives Matter movement as a way to
Mhm.
appeal to white racists, and she's getting selfies taken with Klan members. I mean, just a
Yeah.
repellent person. And then you have Renee Montgomery, her star player, 11-year veteran, say to her, like, hey, can we meet and actually talk about this? And being rebuffed even a meeting. And so
Wow.
the WNBA went about, including Renee Montgomery, went about first and foremost endorsing Raphael Warnock, who was at the time polling at 9%. And of course, I
Mhm.
think they gave Warnock a national profile. I think their actions led to his election, and of course that changed the entire complexion of the Senate. It would be nice if the Democrats did something with that, but maybe that's for another time. But it did
No
give them
time.
control of the Senate, and that's incredibly powerful, and that happened because of the WNBA and their intervention in that race. And then Renee Montgomery, the person I mentioned earlier, she retired and joined an investor group, and they bought the Atlanta Dream from Kelly Loeffler. So what is that is where it's almost cinematic, where a player is upset about the racism of her franchise's owner. That player tries to have a conversation with said franchise owner. Said franchise owner basically tells her to go take a flying leap. Said player first gets franchise owner deposed from the Senate and then buys her out. I mean that's something else right there.
That's just karmic justice right there, I think.
Telling you.
And it speaks to the power, the power that sports wields, and yet the public who are not for this movement entrench themselves deeper into their beliefs. And I know you're not a psychologist, but I'm wondering, what do you think the psychology behind that is? I'm just curious
Hmm.
why they don't people don't want to know the truth or the real reasons behind things to
I mean, isn't white blindness as American as apple pie, though? I mean,
mm,
not wanting to know about atrocities committed against Native Americans, or in the transatlantic slave trade, or in how the railroads were made, or in the issue we were talking about before with internment, like this desire to turn a blind eye to racial crimes. I mean, the history of lynching in this country. I mean, this is why there's always been this call for a reckoning, for reparations, because it's this idea that there hasn't been anything acknowledged or learned through the crimes that have helped create this country. I mean, it's almost like a condition. And I think that's one of the reasons why people responded to these kneelers who I interviewed for the book so viciously, is that they're entering a space that is supposed to not have any of these conversations. That's supposed to actually be this symbol of American meritocracy.
mm,
And they're saying, well, no, everything is not good in Mudville. And we're,
mm,
we're gonna we're gonna tell you why. And really forcing people who have chosen to be blind, or I hate that word, who have chosen
mm,
to not acknowledge what was happening, have chosen that lack of acknowledgement and kind of turned it on its head and said, like, we're going to really push you to acknowledge what our issues are, what our grievances are, and the fury that causes. Like, how dare you make me think? I think psychologically has, everything to do with, people not wanting to acknowledge their own complicity.
Mhm. So in terms of power, I remember a Roy Firestone. Remember those Roy
Oh,
Firestone
sure.
World Sports? And he had Spike Lee on, and he had asked, Spike Lee about racism, and Spike unequivocally said, "This is in 1985," and he just says it's about the system. It's not so much about the individual, but racism.
Yeah.
The system can be racist. People can be bigoted and racist, but it's the system. And I'm wondering what the response to sports organizations like the NFL, MLB, NBA, NCAA, and even the universities themselves. They say they're behind the athletes, yet their actions seem to be not jiving with what they're saying.
Yeah, Spike's exactly right. And he was right however many years ago that was it 35 years ago?
Yeah, yeah.
Because it is about the system. And ironically, that's actually the heart of what critical race theory is about. It's about systemic racism and how do we dismantle systems of oppression. And yet the big freak out among, GOP America is how do we stop little Johnny or little Susie from feeling guilty and about racism. They're white children, and but it's not about individual guilt. If they would just let the teachers teach, their kids could learn that. But they don't want their kids to learn that. They don't want their kids to be people who want to dismantle what has, been a precipice and platform of privilege. So, I think institutions like the NCAA and the NFL, it's been carrot and stick all the way since 2016. And this is really part of the Kaepernick effect, quote unquote, also, in that, the mere fact that Colin Kaepernick took that knee, what he was doing was upsetting the racial and labor discipline that has defined so much of the National Football League, the necessity to have that level of labor and racial discipline in that league. And by upsetting that apple cart so much, it was like a warning signal, a canary in the coal mine for organizations like the NCAA to have to figure out how do you offer more to the athletes to prevent an outright rebellion. And so they're in there, or the NFL, putting end racism in the end zone while still practicing racism by keeping Colin Kaepernick out of the league. These are all things that work in conjunction with one another. So it's not like, well, they've been really good on this issue, but terrible on this issue. It's that it's all very connected as part of a plan to keep the system afloat while also acknowledging and absorbing rebellion.
Interesting. That's what makes the actions of these individuals so courageous and wonderful. It's because they knew what they're up against with this. And I look at, Kaepernick, obviously the owners colluded against him and didn't hire him. And they said, their weak reasoning was saying, no, we don't need him. However, he proved to be one of the best quarterbacks in the league at the time, and he was essentially blackballed, which calls to mind what baseball did with segregation 50 years ago, 60 years ago.
I agree.
There was no color line, they claim, yet they found a way to use their power to shut an entire race of people out, which, as I said before, makes all these people, their actions much more remarkable. And I'm sure we've got a few more minutes, and please ask questions in the chat. But I wanted to ask you before, what was one of your favorite stories in your book that you wrote?
Well, they all contain an element of sadness, so I don't really use the term favorite so much, but the one that really stays with me is Rodney Axon Jr., the first one in the book. I
Mhm.
mean, just because Rodney's story, there's a lot of pathos there. Like his family moves from Cleveland to suburban Brunswick, Ohio, precisely so like it can be less dangerous, better school system, better chance for Rodney and his sister. And what do they find when they get to Brunswick is racism, police harassment, so much for feeling safer, and a large amount of alienation at school, a predominantly white school. And Rodney was just like fed up with that, fed up with the videos that he's seeing of police killings, and then he sees Colin Kaepernick take that knee, and it's just like the light bulb going off over his head, like eureka,
Mhm.
this is something that I can do also. And that's
Wow.
what and so he did it, but then the real story comes afterwards with the death threats. Like you have to read the
Mhm.
intricacies, I don't know. You have to read the particulars, there's the word,
Uh-huh.
of how he dealt with his coach, how he dealt with his teammates, because it really does make for an interesting story about how he navigated everything. And yet, despite all he went through, I mean, having to walk his little sister to school because of death threats, I mean, like
Ah,
everything that he went through, I mean, he feels like it was all worth it, and that's really powerful to me.
so, which goes along saying about you writing the book. It definitely it was worth it that you
It
wrote
was
this
worth it.
book then.
I love the experience of writing it. It was hard, but that's nothing worth doing ain't.
Yeah. If anybody has any questions, please type in the Q&A right now. We got a couple more minutes. What my next question while we wait is, what did you learn about yourself by researching and writing this book? Was there something that you found out about yourself that you didn't know?
Well, it sort of connects with what I said before. I really learned about like what my role should be in
Mhm.
terms of building communities of resistance, and about the importance at this point in my life of kind of decentering myself and really trying to help promote these other voices and figuring out ways in which I can support however I could, and having that
Mm,
be something by which I devote myself.
mm. Do you feel you feel energized though, which is great. I
I do. I
mean,
don't look it now because, like I told you before we got on, I was on a plane earlier today. I actually am energized by the experience of doing this book.
well, I'm glad. It looks like there are no questions in the Q&A.
It's
So
okay.
I wanted to take this time to thank you, Dave, and it's
Thank you,
always
Mike.
great to see you. And for your next book, I will be lining up at whatever bookstore you're at.
Thank you, Mike. And I can't wait to read what you are conjuring, because you told me about your book before we got on the air, and I'm energized by that. So
Well, thank you.
please keep me in the loop on all things Mike.
And we'll stay in touch definitely, Dave. So thank you. And thank you everyone for joining us. And thank you for weathering our little storm outside, and have a nice evening. Good night.